You've done lots of exploration into mythology from different cultures around the world, particularly in relation to creation myths. And you've recently written a book called Man-Made, the Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. So, first of all, I just wanted to start with what has really inspired you to write about this subject?
Well, one of the things that started this was there were a lot of TV shows that talked about 2012. And in watching those shows, they would talk about, well, the Mayan talk about these 5 cycles of time. And in India, they say the same thing. And in Egypt, they have similar references. But they never talked about what their cosmology was and what their belief systems were. And so I started digging into that, trying to get more clarity about what's going on and what the truth is, because, you know, you watch stuff on TV and you just don't know. And in doing that, I was starting to pick up different parallels. I mean, you know, the different cultures talking about different cycles of time. And even though they didn't match up, and I didn't believe that the whole 2012 thing was really going to happen in the way that was being proposed, I was starting to find these similarities between their cultural information, their mythological information that just intrigued me. That's the best word I can use. Is it intrigued me to dig deeper and look further into the topic.
That's really interesting that there are these similarities between cultures that apparently had no way of having contact with each other. I mean, no real transportation to meet with each other and exchange stories. So to see those similarities is quite intriguing. When you were investigating into the mythology from different cultures, was there anything that really jumped out at you as being really surprising or perplexing?
Well, I mean, just the fact that they had these very similar stories was, one, fascinating by themselves. And you know, when we talk about mythology, we're talking about the stories of the gods. And when we think of God, quote unquote, we think of this kind, loving individual who is loving and supportive of us. But when you read mythology from around the world, God is anything but kind and loving, or the gods are anything but kind and loving. And so that was one thing that was kind of interesting to us. One of the other things that we feel we uncovered was the fact that when you read some of the very early narratives, the question we asked was, who is really telling these stories? Was it our stories about the gods, or was it the gods' stories about themselves that they transmitted to us and then we just added them into our cultural stories? Which would explain very clearly why we find these parallels, because it wasn't a local indigenous fabrication, but instead something that we were told that happened prior to mankind's creation.
That's really interesting. And when you're talking about the similarities, close similarities between mythology, are you mainly talking about in relation to creation, so how we all started? You know, you hear stories about the sky gods coming down, creating man. Is that the type of mythology you mainly focus on?
I mean, that is an aspect of it. One of the things that was, again, this whole project was just so interesting, and we went in with our own beliefs, and the more we uncovered, we had to really stop and reassess what we knew based on the mythological record. And where mankind is and where mankind is created in that storyline is actually at the end of the story. I mean, by the time we got to the creation of mankind in our book, we ended the narrative after the flood, basically, with the advent of civilization. But that ends up being like the last 2 or 3 chapters of the book. So it was very late in the narrative.
So how far back do these myths actually go, if we're talking about where they started?
I mean, our belief is, based on the narratives that are provided, that they go back to I have to think about this, about 4.5 billion years ago, with the formation of the planet Earth, and Mars. Because there are a number of things that they talk about, and it seems clear that these gods came and actually did terraforming on the Earth, at least to us. Yeah. And you can't do terraforming 1,000,000 years ago. I mean, I guess you could, but it doesn't make sense. Which I think is interesting because, like, Michael Cremo in his work talks about these civilizations that go back millions of years, and from a mythological perspective, that thought is supported.
Mm-hmm. And one of the key points that comes out in your book is about this word myth and mythology, that nowadays we associate this word myth with something fanciful, like a fairy tale or a story that our ancient ancestors just made up and it's been passed along. But one of the key themes in your book is that these myths are actually accounts of things that people experienced all those times, all those ages ago, and that's why it has passed on in such a clear way, because it was important information that they wrote down, or not even wrote down, but passed verbally from generation to generation. What evidence do you think there is that these myths are actually based on fact and not just fanciful stories?
Well, one of the things that we find when we look at the mythology is, in one area in particular, is the weapons that they use. They talk about these things that, emitted quote unquote lightning, which from a contemporary perspective seems more like some kind of a laser beam, or these weapons that could smoke mountains and level, trees, and the flying chariots, that you have to have something that comes from some, that is derived from some piece of knowledge. And it seems absurd to think that these people could just make it up, just out of the blue. When we write contemporarily, when we write science fiction, there is always something based on our history that we take and maybe bring it into a contemporary perspective, or take it and take it into a future perspective. So there's that aspect. But even when we go into the documented records, so when we talk about the Sumerian body of work that has been found, making a clay tablet is not an easy thing. There are thousands of them. They were great record keepers. But one of the things that doesn't make sense is, why would they write down a story that was science fiction and then try to pass it off as being true?
Yes, exactly.
Because it's, even into the Greek time and the Roman times, they believed in this pantheon of gods, and they believed that these gods were gods. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that they saw them as being representations of lightning or storms or fire. That wasn't their belief. It is just contemporarily that we look at it and go, oh, well, they just made that all up.
And I think nowadays it's very interesting to see that scientists and archaeologists are starting to investigate into the reality of these myths, and actually starting to come out with evidence to prove the reality of them. For example, in the Mahabharata, where they refer to, as you said, these chariots, that the description of the weapons are almost like nuclear, and they describe the symptoms that the people experience, like radiation exposure symptoms. And archaeologists now are finding areas where they've got an old city which shows that it's been exposed to such intense heat, equivalent to that of a nuclear bomb. And so now science and archaeology is starting to really follow up on these areas.
But they just seem very hesitant in redating things. I just read an article the other day where they are speculating that Stonehenge might actually be like from 7,000 BC, which puts it 5,000 years earlier, which chronologically speaking, would make a whole lot more sense with the megalithic builders. But I mean, how long has the story that it was built in 3100 BC, or Stonehenge 1 was built in 3100 BC, been stuck there? And the pyramids and the Sphinx complex. And so I think people need to be willing to step outside the box and look at the evidence from a new perspective, and not from a guideline that was put out hundreds of years ago that it apparently is not true, and trying to squish these round pegs into square holes.
And I guess that's the human tendency, to continue to prove the things we already believe to be true, rather than to try to disprove what we believe to be true. So that's the obstacle that we face, I suppose.
I just think that it's interesting when we talk about the gods and, you know, them coming down from the sky and having these amazing weapons. You know, it's only in the Western world that we run into this problem. If you ask anyone that comes out of India, they don't have issues in talking about their history and culture going back thousands and thousands of years. And if you ask in the Native American culture, they truly believe that the gods came from the skies and came down and interacted with them. And so it's only really in the Western world that we've been kind of brainwashed into thinking something else. And it's like, no, we need to let it go. And
yes, and a good example of that was at the recent citizen hearing on disclosure, where they had people from different countries talking about UFOs and contact with extraterrestrials. And there were some representatives from South American countries, and they were saying, well, actually, we're very open in our country about this phenomena. And in fact, in one of the countries, they teach the children in the schools that, yes, there are UFOs. Yes, we have records of, you know, visitations by extraterrestrials. It's not considered something taboo to talk about, and you're definitely not ridiculed for talking about it, as you are in many Western countries.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. I didn't get a chance to listen to those hearings, but yay, a step forward maybe.
Big step forward.